Hey Andrew, so
Hi, Nick.
just interested in what's going on right now in the market and what's your view on how customers are looking at change right now?
Well, I think aspirationally, and if you're lucky, I think organisations align their vision to their strategy, to their change portfolio, and everybody's singing the same song across the organisation, pulling in the right direction. Everyone knows what's happening, when it's happening, etc. But I think in the real world, what's happening is most people stand up projects, have a relatively isolated view on what else is going on in either some of the capability that they're touching, processes they're touching, some of the technologies they're touching, and they are at best creating a brief to say this is what we want to do. Um, Very rarely do they measure the return on the investment because there's so many other things that come in that kind of challenge, other parts of those businesses that change was due to impact. And I think it's a relatively isolated process, and it's isolated, and the isolation itself causes problems in the whole change arena.
Okay, so GDPR is forcing organisations to look at data in a different way. What do you think about that?
Well, I think and I hope that what's happening with GDPR is that businesses now have to think about not just about data, but where data resides, how it's used, how it's processed, how it's accessed, how it's managed, maintained, retained, etc. And through that process, they have to recognise um, which parts of the organisation actually have a role to play in accessing it, in using it, which assets have a role to play in transferring it, managing it, processing it, which suppliers, which customers. There's a kind of a big, well, the GDPR is forcing organisations to think how each of these things are interconnected. Now, that's kind of a very complex business architectural arena, enterprise architectural arena, and generally people just do things in silos. They kind of say, this is our process catalogue, this is our portfolio catalogue, this is our asset catalogue, this is our supply catalogue. But this is, I think, it's forcing organisations now to think, why, hold on a second, we now need to connect the dots here. And I'm thinking that, and I'm hoping that actually what happens now is that businesses think about their change agenda in that type of way, as opposed to being thin and vertical. They actually start thinking, well, what happens if we start connecting some of these dots? Is there a different way of us actually delivering some of the scope that's required within this brief, actually by plugging it into an existing delivery mechanism, as opposed to standing up new projects every single time? So that's what my hope is, and I think GDPR is forcing organisations to think differently, which is for the greater good.
Absolutely. And GDPR obviously therefore represents an opportunity for companies, do you think?
Massive
Why?
opportunity. Because they don't have a choice. There's a compelling event, and so regulation drives a behaviour in a lot of industries that are possibly used to that type of that type of force or that type of requirement, and therefore it gives them the opportunity to think, well, what do we currently have stored where? And what generally happens is businesses get very scared about data and joining data and having these huge repositories, or interconnecting inter-operations and all of the data that sit behind those things, because I think that there's just too much data. But really, you don't necessarily need to go into a load of depth. You just need to connect where it's relevant. And I think the fact that the opportunities come with standing up cloud environments now is forcing organisations to think what data they pushed into those clouds. So therefore, they're actually going through data cleansing, normalisation processes. And I think with technology, with tools, you can actually think a little bit differently about connecting some of those dots where relevant, and then using the data and the analysis and the insight you get from those relationships to actually answer questions in a more succinct, relevant and quicker fashion, because it gives you the opportunity, whereas before things were siloed and that opportunity was costly, and therefore people don't want cost and they don't want delay, and that's why they tend to just do things in isolation.
So hurrah for GDPR.
Hurrah, indeed.